Historically, stock option plans have been used as a way for companies to reward top management and key employees and link their interests with those of the company and the shareholders. This concept of key employees, though, has grown, and more companies have decided that key employees are many employees of the business altogether. Since the late 1980s, the use of stock options has grown almost ninefold to today. Today, broad-based stock options are norm in high-tech companies. Many people are familiar with stories of Facebook, Apple, or Google rank-and-file employees becoming millionaires through stock options. A 2014 survey estimated that 70.2 million employees now have stock options, so they're an important mechanism to reward employees today. What exactly is a stock option? A stock option gives an employee the right to buy a certain number of shares in the company at a fixed price for a certain number of years. The price at which the option is granted is called the grant price, and is usually the fair market price at the time the options are granted. Employees are granted with these options. They hope that the share price is going to go up and they'll be able to eventually cash in by exercising the stock at the grant price, and hope that the difference between the current market price at that time will be much higher and they'll be able to sell it based on the appreciation. There's two kinds of stock options, each with their unique rules and tax consequences. There's incentive stock options, and then there's non-qualified stock options. We'll discuss the differences later in this presentation. The reasons for granting stock options. Both privately and publicly held companies make options available for a number of reasons. First, they want to attract and keep good workers. By tying their incentives to the performance of the company overall through stock options, it's a way to maintain their employment and keep them incentivized. They also want employees to feel like owners or partners in the business. In that sense, they'll take a greater sense of pride and a greater sense of direct involvement in the business itself. They want to hire skilled workers by offering compensation that goes beyond the salary. And this is particularly important in the startup companies, where you want to hold on to as much cash as possible and yet at the same time create alternate mechanisms of incentives and motivation which stock options would create. And for growth-oriented smaller companies, options are a great way essentially to create employees, having them give them a piece of future growth while at the same time, as I've mentioned, preserving cash. Options, though, may not be perfect for companies which are smaller in nature, where earnings aren't expected to grow quickly. For those types of companies, you may want to look in terms of other incentive plans. Why issue options in the first place? Why not just issue stock, perhaps? The reasons why stock options are granted instead of stock directly is first and foremost the idea of phantom tax. When you actually grant stock to an employee, then the person actually receives the value of the stock as income. For instance, if the stock is worth $2 per share, let's say, then the $2 per share multiplied by the amount of shares you get, let's say you have 2,000 shares, means that you would receive as an employee something of value of $4,000. However, if you're getting shares in a private company, and those shares are not liquid and you can't trade them over the New York Stock Exchange or something, then you have nowhere that you could actually liquidate the stock and get cash back. However, the IRS will still require you to pay taxes on that stock, and that concept is called phantom income-related taxes. It's also a way to reward employees for future growth of the company and to align incentives directly. When you grant a stock option at fair market value, what you're essentially requiring the employee to do is to share in the upside of the company above and beyond the then current fair market value of the overall company. If the company, for instance, is worth $5 million, the stock option means that the employee is incentivized and basically benefits as the company itself grows from 5 million to hypothetically 10 million or 50 million. But when it comes to the initial 5 million, then the employee doesn't necessarily benefit from that. How do you create stock options? The first part of setting up a stock option would be to establish the stock option plan. The option plan is a comprehensive benefit plan under which options are issued. The plan itself determines the total number of shares that you reserve and set aside for all of your employees and potentially other service providers, and it describes the general parameters of the plan itself. In order to set up the plan, first thing you need is to have the board of directors of the company review and approve the plan. In addition, you'll also need the stockholders to approve the plan at least 12 months after the plan has been approved by the board. This is required for certain securities laws and tax law purposes. After the plan has been formed, then you'd also need to make certain securities law filings with the Department of Corporations of California and possibly the Securities and Exchange Commission. Then next comes the actual issuance of options to employees. First, you would set up a notice of option grant and a stock option agreement. The notice would summarize all the terms of the option grant itself, which we'll describe later. The option grant is signed, the option agreement itself, is signed by the optionee of the company and describes all the rights for the option which they're actually agreeing to. This may include things like the price of the option, how long the option lasts, and other provisions. Both the notice and the agreement are subject to the comprehensive stock option plan itself. The second thing you would need are board approval. Each stock option plan needs to be approved by the board, along with the actual option price at which the option is being issued to. This should be done contemporary to the option plan itself. Oftentimes, companies will promise employees options, but then hold off the board consent of those very same options for several months, and this can potentially cause problems. If the company has appreciated in value from the first time that the employee was promised options versus some other time when the board ultimately approves those options, then the fair market value, or that strike price at which the option may be exercised at, would have to be increased to be at the time that the board approves the actual option issuance. This relates to another issue and which caused problems in the past, and it caused something called the backdating scandal. The backdating scandal happened about 10 years ago or so, and there was a time when the board of directors would routinely backdate the actual approval of the option issuance. For instance, if today in October 2016 the board was reviewing the possible issuance of stock options to their employees, they may claim that the board consent happened actually in August of 2016. This would be because the price per share, the fair market price per share back in August, was lower than the price in October. And so the board of directors would use this mechanism in order to provide a lower exercise price for their employees. However, this created a problem because there was technically fraud. They were issuing stock options that they claimed were approved in August, but technically were approved in October. As an example, this led to more than 130 public companies at that time, in 2006, being investigated for this backdating scandal, and it led to the firing or resignation of over 50 top executives in many public companies, including those such as Broadcom, United Health Group, and Comverse Technologies. Also, as an example, in September 2009, James Tracy, the former COO of Monster Worldwide, was sent to prison for 2 years because of this backdating scandal. So again, when it comes to board approval, make sure that the board approval of the stock options are happened at the time that the optionees are expecting receipt of the options. How many shares should be reserved for the stock option plan? This may vary from company to company, but generally speaking, most technology companies and startups will reserve anywhere from 10 to 15% of their current equity for stock options. For instance, if a company has, let's say, 5 million shares outstanding, including their investors and their founders, then they may reserve anywhere from 500,000 to 700,000 shares as a part of their stock option plan. The stock option exercise price. The exercise price for an optionee is going to be measured at the, quote, fair market value. Fair market value means the fair price of the common stock for the company at that time. For public companies, this would usually be the stock trading price. For instance, if Facebook stock is trading today at $100 per share, then if someone who was receiving Facebook options today would have their option exercise price at $100 per share. For private companies, this determination of fair market value may be a little bit difficult to determine because there is no such stock market to determine the price at. However, it's imperative that an exercise price be measured at the fair market value. Because if the IRS ultimately determines that the option exercise price was less than the fair market value at that time, it can cause problems under a statute called 409A of the Internal Revenue Code. In 409A basically states that if options are granted below the then current fair market price at the time, the option holders would have to immediately pay taxes on all their vested equity and pay an additional 20% excise penalty tax and possibly interest on these unpaid taxes. The company may also face penalties as well. So therefore, it's very important for private companies to issue stock options with an exercise price at fair market value. But how do you determine fair market value? Section 409A also provides a safe harbor for private companies as long as they've done a valuation of the fair market value as follows. This fair market value could be determined, this valuation must be determined or performed by a qualified individual or by an independent appraiser. The valuation must be performed within the last 12 months and must have been evidenced by a written report. As long as those three standards are required or are satisfied, the actual fair market value that's been determined through that valuation will be a safe harbor from 409A. In other words, the IRS will never challenge that valuation, and both the optionee as well as the company can feel rest assured that the IRS will not challenge it based on it being lower than fair market value. When can options be exercised? One of the most important restrictions for options is the concept of the vesting period. Stock options shouldn't be granted to employees in which an employee may be able to exercise all of the options all at once at any time. This is because if that were allowed, then an employee could theoretically exercise all the options and quit the very next day, which would defeat the purpose of the stock option incentive in the first place. The vesting concept requires the actual exercisability of the option to be delayed until the employee has worked a certain number of period of time. Typically, a vesting period of exercisability would work like this. The entire option, or 25% of the option shares would be exercisable after 1 year of service has passed. This would be commonly termed as the cliff vesting. After that time, the remaining 75% would be vested over the next 3 years on either a monthly basis or a quarterly basis. Now, this may vary from company to company. Some companies may allow for vesting over a 3-year period, or others may require over a 5-year period, but the general concept is still the same. An employee needs to work at the company for a certain period of time before that they may be able to exercise their options. How long does an actual option last? Usually the stock option will be exercisable for a period of 5 years, but it may also be as long as 10 years. Now, an option, though, will be subject to termination if the actual employee terminates his service, and we'll discuss that in a little bit. So what happens upon termination of the employee or consultant? Typically, the option grant after the service provider termination will terminate for right after the termination, and the rights may be able to vary from company to company. For instance, if the termination were for misconduct, then the stock option would terminate immediately. There wouldn't be any extension period of time for which the option could be exercised. If the termination were for death or disability, the option would terminate typically 12 months after the service termination. For termination for any other reason, whether the service provider voluntarily quit or was let go by the company, the option would terminate 90 days after the termination of the service. So for instance, if an employee quit in October 2016, then the stock option may be exercised at any time before January 2017. Sometimes, even after an option has been exercised, a private company will impose repurchase rights if the optionee ever wanted to sell the exercised shares. This is a mechanism by which the company would know who all of its shareholders were and to keep track and prevent shares from being sold to persons that they might not want to actually receive the stock. This is for private companies only, of course. Now, earlier we discussed the concept of incentive stock options versus non-qualified stock options, and I want to describe the differences between the two. Generally speaking, incentive stock options provides you with more beneficial tax treatment than non-qualified options. The general rule of thumb is that incentive stock options won't be taxed upon exercise based on the then current fair market value of the stock compared to the actual exercise price of the underlying option itself. For a non-qualified stock option, there would be a taxable event upon the exercise. Now that's generally speaking, and let me get into some of the details between the two. First off, incentive stock options may only be granted to employees of the company. All other persons that may receive stock, consultants, members of the board of directors, and other persons may receive only non-qualified stock options. With respect to stock options, this is the general taxation events that happen. When the option is first granted, there is no taxable event. At the exercise date, if an employee has exercised this incentive stock option, then the difference between the fair value and the exercise price, commonly known as the spread, will not be taxed in accordance with regular tax rates. Now I say in accordance with regular tax rates because there is something called an alternate minimum tax. Its AMT is a minimum tax rate that all individuals must pay. And for AMT purposes, this spread would be factored in. So you should consult with your tax advisors when it actually comes time to exercise even an incentive stock option. But generally speaking, incentive stock options would not be taxed at the exercise event. At the time of the sale of the stock, after the incentive stock option has been exercised and acquired, there may be what's called different tax treatments as well. If there's, quote, a qualifying disposition, in other words, the stock has been held for more than 1 year after the date of exercise and more than 2 years after the date that the options were granted, then the proceeds from the sale will be treated as long-term capital gains. And long-term capital gains is generally speaking less than the ordinary tax rate. However, if the stock was sold was not held for that length of a period of time, it wasn't held for 1 year since the date of exercise and 2 years from the date of the initial option grant, then the proceeds will be taxed at ordinary income tax rates. Now let's move on to non-qualified stock options. For non-qualified stock options, again, there would be no taxable event at the actual grant date. However, at the exercise date, the difference between the fair market value at the time of the stock and the exercise price, i.e. the spread, is going to be taxable at ordinary income. And this is going to apply whether the company is a public company or a private company, and even if the company is private, the difference between the two will still be a taxable event. And at the time of the sale of a stock of a non-qualified stock option, the difference between the sales proceeds and the tax basis will be taxed at long-term or short-term capital gains as long as the stock has been held for more than 1 year. The idea of measuring it from the initial tax, or when the 2-year period from the stock grant date won't be applicable to a non-qualified stock option. Other requirements for incentive stock options, once again, incentive stock options may only be granted to employees. They can't be granted to other persons. They must be granted under a written plan document that's been approved by the board and the stockholders, and the stockholders must have approved it within 12 months of the actual plan formation. The option must be granted within 10 years of the adoption or the shareholder approval, and the option exercise price must equal or exceed the fair market value at the time the option grant was made. So this is the general overview of stock options, and here are some practical considerations you should take into mind when you're thinking about setting up a stock option plan. Generally, when you're designing a stock option plan, companies need to consider how much stock that they're willing to make available, whether and who should receive those particular options, whether it should be all employees, whether it should be executive officers, whether it should be the developers of the company, of the software, for instance, or the underlying technology, or perhaps the sales and marketing group. One of the common errors that many startups will make is to grant too many options too soon, thereby depleting the reserved stock option plan and needing to issue more options than they initially planned to make. Finally, one of the other important considerations for the plan is the underlying purpose of the plan. Is the plan intended to give all employees stock in the company or provide a benefit just to key employees? Does the company wish to promote long-term ownership, or is it a one-time benefit? Is it intended to create a sense of ownership for the employees? These answers to these questions will be crucial in defining the specific plan characteristics, such as the eligibility for the persons for the options, the allocation, the vesting, the holding periods, and other aspects of the stock option plan.